Hello, government students. Today we're going to talk about freedom of and from religion as we start our civil rights and liberties units. In class we'll be looking at this particular learning target a little bit more, but kind of have to build a background on it. Where do we get that from? We get it from the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. When it comes to freedom of religion, there's really the two parts. There's the freedom of religion, that's the prohibiting free exercise thereof part. That's what we tend to think of when we think of freedom of religion. But there is also the freedom from religion, which is the establishment clause portion of this, the first part. And these two different parts work together to be able to protect religious freedom here in the United States. Why should we do this? Why even bother protecting religious freedom? A lot of that has to do with our history. Religion has always been a very important part of America and American culture and the American ethos throughout our history. And it goes all the way back to the Pilgrims coming across on the Mayflower. So if you don't know the story behind the Mayflower, there were English colonists, English pilgrims who had left England because of religious persecution. After the English Civil War, their kind of group had fallen out of favor with the majority of England and were starting to be persecuted for their stricter religious beliefs. And as a result of that, they left England and they headed over to the Netherlands. The Netherlands they went there because of religious freedom and the opportunities there. However, many of these pilgrims began to feel that their kids especially were beginning to lose the cultural elements that kind of made them English, instead kind of more aligned with some of the Dutch culture. And they wanted to still kind of consider themselves to be very, very strongly English. So they decided to leave the Netherlands and come over to the New World and establish a new colony, which they eventually did, coming across on the Mayflower and wrote the whole Mayflower Compact, which has become really an important part of American culture, especially in understanding that we value religious freedom. And that's really kind of where this idea of freedom of and from religion is coming from, is that we have the right to go ahead and practice our own beliefs, and that the government is not going to come in and force a particular religious belief upon us. What free expression is trying to do, what it's really its major goal, is to prevent a cultural minority from using the power of the state, right, using the government to impose their beliefs upon other people. So, freedom of expression, okay, whether that's religion, speech, press, assembly, petition, all the First Amendment rights are kind of in that freedom of expression area. It exists primarily to protect the rights of minorities, of smaller groups of people, not the popular ones. Religion in America, as I mentioned before, has always been really, really religious. Right, currently, about 72 or 77.2% of Americans identify themselves with a specific religion. This is based off of 2020 census data. And 70% of them identify themselves as Christian. So the vast majority of Americans identify themselves as a Christian. 41% as a Protestant, 22% as Roman Catholic. There's a few other groups that they would be there as well to make up the remainder of those percents. But predominantly the majority is Christian. You also have 1% that are Jewish, 1% of them are Muslim or followers of Islam. The largest group of Muslims is here in the state of Michigan, over in Dearborn. And even the Jewish community, not here in Michigan, but in the United States, is actually the largest community of Jews. Right? We have the largest Jewish population of any nation, including Israel. We also have 1% that are Buddhist and about 0.5% that are Hindu. That's of our total U.S. population. However, the largest growing group in America is actually the religiously unaffiliated. And this is a group that's growing quite a bit. About 26% don't follow any religious organization or any organized religion. And what this means is not that they are not religious. It just simply means they don't have a connection with a particular group of people. They still may very well believe in religion. To not believe in a religion means you have to be an atheist or at least at best an agnostic. Atheists only make up about 3.1% of the population in the United States. But these religiously unaffiliated are a vast growing group, especially among millennials. To kind of look at some statistics here, back in 1990, this group only made up about 8% of this whole U.S. population. Now it's up to 26%. In 2019, it was at 17%. So you can start to see that growth over a 30-year time frame here, where we've moved now from 8% in 1990 to 26%. That is a significant increase. And really, we haven't seen that kind of an increase anywhere in our history before, as we start to become maybe a little bit less organized religiously. So that's just kind of some interesting thoughts there. But now let's delve into the actual religion here, and how is religious freedom protected by the First Amendment. Okay? You probably heard of this idea before, the separation of church and state. This is not something that's new. It's been around for a long time. But why should we even bother separating church and state if we are so religious? And again, that's because of that religious freedom being important. And really what we're trying to do as Americans in separating church and state is two things: protect religion from being corrupted by government, and preventing good government being corrupted by religious conflict. All right, by kind of having those two things go on, and we'll explain here in just a minute what those exactly mean. But first, let's look at the phrase here, separation of church and state. A lot of people think this is in the Constitution, but it's not. It comes instead from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote while he was president, a letter to the Danbury Baptists in Massachusetts. And what he said is this: he said, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, and that he owes account to none other for his faith and his worship, that the legitimate powers of government should reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, which declare that their legislature should make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." And what Jefferson's really trying to say here is that the main purpose of government, right, what government is designed to do, its purpose is to judge people's actions, right? To look at what they do, not what they believe, not their opinions. And as a result of that, when government is considering legislation, when it's considering laws and enforcing regulations and such, it should have nothing to do with their beliefs. It should instead focus only on their action. That's what he says here, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. And that's where this idea of separation of church and state becomes about, because as soon as you begin to combine these things, now that line gets a lot more blurred. And now when do we start moving away from just judging actions, but also start to consider what a person believes as well? So the question we kind of have to ask ourselves is, how high of a wall of separation do we build? Okay? Here's some arguments for a really tall wall, something that is going to prevent any type of communication across. Because you need to protect good government from religious conflict, right? There are tons of conflicts in all different kinds of religion, whether that's a church, whether that's a temple, whether it's a mosque or a synagogue. There are internal conflicts, and there are conflicts between different groups of people, even within a larger group of religion. You look at Protestantism, Christianity, for example, there are hundreds of different denominations within Protestantism. And a lot of those groups have striking differences in belief and have actually had actual conflicts between each other over some of these issues. There have been wars that have been fought in world history between Protestants and Catholics, between other different religious groups, simply because of differences in a belief. And by making a higher wall of separation, you can keep those conflicts that tend to occur in religious settings from impacting government. So that's one reason. Addition to that is to protect religion from political corruption. And this kind of goes even back to some of the framers, not their own personal experiences, but some of the things that they watched going on in other countries at the time, particularly France. France at the time of our country's founding was a monarchy in which you had three real groups that kind of made up the legislature. You had the nobility, you had the clergy, and you had the Estates General, or you had the commoners in what we call the Estates General. And within this group, any two out of three groups that agreed could make legislation. The nobility was very much controlled by the monarchy. Okay? The clergy was controlled by the Roman Catholic Church. And these two groups, even though they made up a very small percentage of the population of people within France at the time, essentially ran the country. And the commoners could try and go ahead and exercise their freedom and try to speak their mind, but they never had any real political power. And what we framers began to see as a part of this is there was a lot of corruption that kind of crossed over between the clergy and the monarchy, as there were a number of conflicts and just trying to oppress the people and preventing them from really actually having a voice in politics. Eventually, we get the French Revolution, which is a bloody mess, with thousands of people dying during the Reign of Terror. That kind of puts an end to that particular system. However, the framers are very much thinking about those things as they're beginning to develop this idea of protecting religion from political corruption as well. Additionally, by having a high wall of separation between government, you're not having the government favor any particular religion, and instead it reinforces this idea that you are free to believe what you want. Like, the government's not coming after you because you hold a different belief than, Joey down the street or Jane, next door, that you have the right to believe what you want. But at the same time, there are a lot of arguments to be made for a lower wall, a situation where you're neighbors and you can go ahead and talk across the fence. And there are certain times where religion and government end up having the same kind of end goal. So a couple of things that may be strong arguments for a low wall of separation between church and state are that religion teaches us how to use freedom responsibly. It teaches us how to be individuals who are concerned with doing the right thing, about being moral individuals, and how to act in certain situations that are not going to negatively impact other people. Religion also teaches that there is a power above the state, and it reinforces the idea that there is something more powerful than government, and that government is not the end of all. It is not the most powerful thing around. And in America, where we have a system of limited government, that is something that helps kind of keep everything else in check and keeps government in check as well. But one of the strongest arguments for this is the idea that religion preaches a concern for common good. And that is something that government is also striving for, that society itself is not looking out just for the best interests of me and what I can get out of something, but rather considering how this impacts other people as well, considering how my own actions are going to influence and affect the decisions and the lives of the people around me. And that sometimes, yes, I might have the freedom to go ahead and do something, but also is that also making it mean I have the right to do it? And this comes to really, really stark contrast as you start to think about how our rights engage with other people's rights, and when do my rights start to trample on other people's rights. And religion kind of comes in and says, look, if you're going to be in a situation where you're trampling on somebody else's rights, then maybe you should begin to rethink your actions a little bit. And it kind of teaches some of those moral sides of things to consider how your actions are impacting other people as well. So there are a lot of arguments there for a lower wall of separation, saying that in certain situations it's a good idea for maybe the church and the state to actually work together. How do we solve all of that? That's where it gets complicated, and that's where it gets kind of murky waters. And what we've had to do instead is go back to that First Amendment, okay, those two different types, to help understand what our framers intended and provide some further clarification. And what the Supreme Court done is they've had through a number of different Supreme Court cases. We'll talk about many different ones in class. They've kind of laid out some rules to kind of follow to help guide us as we go about this long, ongoing discussion of how high of a wall, how low of a wall should we have. So there are two parts to religious freedom in the United States. We have first the Establishment Clause that says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. This is mean the government can't endorse a particular religion. They can't back a particular religion. They can't force people to follow a particular religious doctrine. Because by doing so, what they're essentially doing is they're saying, look, this is the most important religion. And this is one of the reasons why in the United States we don't have a state-sponsored religion. Yes, the majority of people within the United States are Christian. That does not mean that the government can endorse Christianity, endorse certain ideas and traditions that are unique to that particular religion. It has to be fair to all different religions. And that's an important part of the Establishment Clause. The other part that we tend to think of when we think of religious freedom is the more well understood part, the Free Exercise Clause, about practicing religion. And what the Free Exercise Clause says is that you can't prohibit a person from practicing their religious beliefs and practicing their religion. That they have a right to go ahead and do that without fear that the government's going to go ahead and take them away. And that's the more traditional part. We're going to go ahead and get into some of the limitations on these. Both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise have certain limitations established by the Supreme Court that kind of lay out a little bit better understanding. We'll get into that in class. All right, so I'll see you then.